So, Claudia, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of the entire Cumberland team. So, we started the Cumberland Strategies Women in Politics program to tackle the question of why there are so few women in politics. And for those women who are in politics, why are they treated so differently from their male counterparts? And we don't think that we can talk about women in politics without talking about how politics and government policies affect women. So, that's why we wanted to talk to you today. So Claudia has written a report called the She-Covery Project, and it examines the circumstances that led to the pandemic having a disproportionate impact on women and the policies that the government could put in place to help give women a leg up in the recovery process, or the She-Covery process, as you've called it. So there's no doubt that COVID-19 had a negative impact or a disproportionate impact on women. And in your report, you highlight numerous reasons for this. So I just want to ask you, first of all, why did you write this report? And then can you walk us through at kind of a high level what you examined and why in your report?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on your program, Carys. So the idea for our She-Covery report came pretty early into the pandemic, back in March 2020, just as soon as the province ordered businesses and schools to close. We saw a pretty dramatic impact on jobs in the province. And as a business association, of course, the chamber was watching those numbers closely as Statistics Canada was publishing kind of the monthly employment numbers. And one thing that stood out to me and many others at the time was the difference in the number of jobs being lost by men and women. And many of our members were also expressing concerns about this. So we entered into a partnership with Ontario Power Generation and the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University. And with their support, I was able to spend the summer doing a bunch of interviews with women in different sectors, but also employers and HR professionals to understand what was happening, what we could do to recover from it, but also longer term, make sure that it never happened again. So we ended up releasing this report in September of 2020, and the first sections kind of cover the situation as it was at that point. So by then, schools were reopening, and after the first wave, there was some lifting of public health restrictions. So we were able to see not just short-term job losses at that point, but also labor force participation rates, which show kind of how many people have dropped out of the market entirely and are not even looking for jobs. So specifically, we saw that women in Ontario between the ages of 25 and 54 initially lost more than twice as many jobs as men, and women's participation rate in the labor market fell to its lowest level in 30 years. Both men and women had picked up jobs over the summer, so there was some improvement, but there was this persistent gap between men and women that just kept going. And we also at that point had some survey data on mental health, and we saw that women were experiencing worse stress and depression and outcomes in that sense. And then for women-owned businesses, also worth mentioning that they were more likely to close their doors permanently or lose customers and clients. That's also self-reported data, but we had at that point seen a dramatic impact there. All of these things really important to note that the impacts were more severe for intersectional groups. So racialized women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, single mothers, trans or non-binary people, they were all much more likely to experience those job losses and mental health impacts. So we spent a good section of the report just digging into that data. And then we spent the rest of the research looking at potential solutions and policy recommendations, which we grouped into 5 categories. So we have leadership and accountability, childcare, workforce development, entrepreneurship, and flexible work. And kind of collectively, we feel like these are important for a strategy for women's recovery. And I mean, from our perspective, it's morally important and it's ethical to have women participate in the labor market, but it's also really good for business and really good for the economy if you have a population that is able to kind of participate to their full potential.
Right. So in your report, you stated that setting targets and tracking outcomes around Ontario's She-Covery would build kind of shared accountability among stakeholders and encourage more concrete actions. What did this look like in 2020? What does this look like now? And what do you and what does the OCC recommend for those at the top?
Yeah, so one of the things that came most often in my research interviews was this idea that what gets measured gets done, which is very cliche, but it's also very true. And at that point, and I think still now, there's a lack of consistent targets that everyone is working towards. So we've known for many years that women are underrepresented in specific sectors. In Ontario, just like 7% of trades and 20% of technology jobs are held by women. So it's very low. And just a tangent, because they're also underrepresented on management positions. And there was a list that was released a couple of years ago of the 100 top paid executives in Canada. And I think the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I believe, had looked at the list and found that there were more people named Brian or Paul than there were women on that list. So there's a huge gap, and we've known for a while, but there's no real accountability or incentive for organizations to actually like go beyond saying nice things around International Women's Day to actually have strategies. And so the challenge is that you can't put the whole responsibility on any single group. So it's not just employers or post-secondary institutions or government or high schools. They all have to collectively work together. And that's where we've kind of recommended that we have these society-wide targets that we're all pushing towards. Employment, but also enrollment in different post-secondary streams, how many hours are spent on unpaid family care between men and women. That's the kind of thing we should all be working to improve. And some people will take this further and say we also need quotas. So we're requiring employers or schools to have specific representation, not just targets, but actual mandatory. And the challenge there is that depending on the sector, they might actually have a hard time finding enough qualified women to fill those positions. So it really is important from our perspective to have more of a incentive approach where everyone is pushing towards these targets. And we have seen some improvements there. In the report, we talk about some standard or target setting initiatives. And then more recently, there's been this 50-30 initiative. It's called, I think, the 50-30 challenge that we're involved in, where you have different businesses committing to increase representation 50% to women and non-binary people, and then 30% other equity-seeking groups. So that's a lot of positive momentum that we're seeing.
For sure. So you mentioned family care, and in your report, you talk a lot about childcare being a barrier for both men and women, working parents, but particularly mothers, and flexible work as well for parents. So, in the context of your report, what does the new childcare agreement between the federal government and the province of Ontario mean for working parents, and more specifically for working mothers?
It's such a historic agreement that was signed recently, because it's almost embarrassing to see how expensive childcare is in Canada. For as much as we pride ourselves on being a great country to live in, childcare is something that parents struggle with, and among OECD countries, we're bottom of the barrel in terms of affordability, if you can even find a spot. So the deal is historic, not just in its size, which is $13 billion in Ontario over 6 years, but also in the approach, which is for the first time investing significantly in the supply. And until now, the approach has been really to subsidize parents, and that has failed to deliver actual improvements in the system because it's severely underfunded. There are areas where there's what's called childcare deserts, where you can't really drive within reasonable distance to a childcare center. The early childhood educator sector is really struggling to retain and attract people because wages aren't high enough. And so with this agreement, there's going to be improvements in the workforce, the ECE sector, and in the spaces and the cost for parents and access, so that parents, not just working 9 to 5, but different job types, will have access to childcare. And what this is going to do for women, but also just parents in general, is increase the number that can participate in the labor force, and not just the number, but the productivity, because at the moment, people are self-selecting into careers that will allow them to balance family care with paid work if they can't afford childcare full-time. But ideally, we want a situation in which people aren't choosing their career based on family responsibilities. They're choosing based on skill sets and interests. So that's much more effective. And in fact, in the skilled trades, the childcare barrier is really huge. A lot of conversations I had, women would say, I was in the trades and I left because there was no way for me to balance that with being a mother. And that's really a shame, and forces them to start over. So it's not effective. So that's great. And also right now, because there are labor shortages, a lot of businesses just need as many workers as they can. So that's going to be huge. And then longer term, we know that high quality childcare leads to better outcomes for children down the line. So they have higher employment rates, higher educational outcomes. So it's better for the economy as a whole when you invest in that quality care early on.
I just want to focus on workforce diversity for a second. So, workforce diversity is a known driver of innovation and resilience, and it's been talked about long before COVID that the inclusion of women has been identified as a big opportunity for economic growth, both in Ontario and Canada, in the world. But during the pandemic, large scale reskilling was needed to pivot workers, and particularly women, which you just mentioned. So, how can we increase women's representation in traditionally male dominant sectors, such as the trades that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so we talk about how the challenge earlier I mentioned is not just on employers or post-secondary, it's kind of throughout the career pipeline. And it really starts in the way that girls and boys are socialized differently. So there's a lot of evidence that you can change these cultural norms by reaching young girls and boys in elementary school. It has to really start as early as that. And there are effective programs that have, for example, women who are employed in the trades or technology or engineering, they go to schools and they talk to girls, and it does seem to indicate that those people tend to think differently about their career paths later in life. So those types of programs can help shift perceptions. But there is a lot of cultural bias within, parents and within society in general that will limit where girls see themselves going in the future, and that's very hard to change. We also have a lot of good evidence that mentorship works. So at any age group, if you have mentors that look like you, then you're more likely to see yourself in a career down the line. And then later, we need kind of targeted training programs. There's a lot of people right now that are shifting in which sector they are. So you can have targeted programs that help diverse people access those high growth sectors. And it's important because those sectors need people, they're growing, wages are really good. So on the skilled trades specifically, some provinces have what's called an Office to Advance Women apprenticeship. So they have a dedicated department that works to connect women with those opportunities and also provides guidance to employers to make sure that they can accommodate diverse, especially women, but diverse people in the sector. So there's a ton of great research and programs already out there. So I think it's really a matter of investing in all of those. And in the report, we've scanned like a number of programs that have really high placement rates and outcomes. So there's some listed there, but like the Skills Ontario Young Women Initiative, the ADAPT program, there's tons of good ones. And it's also, I think, important to recognize that there's discrimination, just to put it bluntly. A lot of these programs won't work if at the end of the day people are entering in a sector where they don't feel like it's inclusive. So there's a lot more that needs to be done within the male dominant sectors to change that culture. And I can tell you some of the stories I heard were just awful. Like there's microaggressions, but there's also people who are extremely qualified for a job, and then they're being told that, you just have to hold the stop sign because we don't think you can do the job itself. And that's just degrading. So there's need for like anti-bias training and a lot more support for employers to make sure that they can keep up.
It's such an unfortunate reality in 2022,
Yeah.
but it's happening. So, on the flip side of this reskilling issue during COVID-19, obviously many women who lost their jobs during the pandemic did reskill and transition to new sectors. And while this is a positive step for a lot, how has reskilling impacted the tourism and hospitality sectors? Are they having a hard time finding staff to return to work?
I can say it really is a challenge for them. And we have lots of surveys and external research to back up the labor shortage in the hospitality and tourism sectors is large. It's not just because women are retraining. There's a bigger issue that started before the pandemic that these sectors are struggling with. But I can tell you it's significant. And our team right now is working on some research for the food and beverage manufacturing sector to kind of see what they can do and what governments can do to help address those shortages. I think automation is going to help fill some of that gap just because the number of jobs that are needed will go down. But in the service sectors like food and accommodations, you're going to need real people. And it's a challenge. There's no easy solution to it.
For sure. All right, I'm just going to pivot here. So, one of my favorite things that you mentioned in the report, or I don't know if favorite's the right word, but I found it very interesting, was that you mentioned that the financial crisis had a disproportionate impact on men, whereas the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on women. So, why do you think that was the case? And how can we learn from these experiences and better prepare for the future?
It's such a different crisis. In the Great Recession of 08, 09, only 18% of the jobs lost in Canada were held by women. So very, very different. The main difference is that COVID is a health crisis by nature. So the restrictions that were put on face-to-face contact meant a lot of people in the service sector lost their jobs. And those tend to be a lot of women overrepresented in those jobs, like restaurants, retail, arts and recreation. It's also because COVID forced schools to close. So there's just certain things about this, the type of the crisis that we're in. But if there's been a silver lining, it's that the crisis has kind of made people reckon with the fact that we have concentration of gender within specific sectors, and then that's not productive from an economic perspective. So I think the lesson is that there are these structural issues that direct people into particular jobs, and that might not be the best job for them. It's just their limitations that they have. So we need to look at things like childcare, again, cultural norms, discrimination, and training opportunities to make sure that from an economic perspective, we're just putting people in jobs that are best suited to them. And again, morally, I think it's the right thing to do.
And I think we need to look at decision making bodies as well. Like you mentioned in the report, they need to contain men and women. There's a disproportionate number of men in decision making bodies, both at the political level and the government level. And sorry, just in your report, you mentioned that these groups should contain men and women and recognize the economic and social importance of advancing women's workforce participation in the post-pandemic era. So, did this ever happen? Did women get their say in the COVID-19 decision-making process?
Yeah, so we saw this play out in the way that decisions were made. And you can see in some of the business support programs, just to give an example, the way that they were designed ended up excluding many women-owned businesses because, for example, sole proprietorships tend to be, there are a lot of women-owned businesses fall within that category, and they were excluded. A lot of these things were corrected and it wasn't intentional. But the bigger issue is that when you don't have diversity within leadership and decision making, the outcomes of those decisions are not inclusive because they're not considering what those different groups need. So there was a lot of room for improvement, both within government and the corporate sector at the leadership table. The provincial and federal governments have each announced task forces on women's recovery. That's something that we encouraged. I don't know that they have led to anything truly constructive yet, but we will see. I think that it's a step, just like the 50-30 challenge. It's a step towards making sure that there's more representation, but it's not going to be solved overnight because, as we mentioned, it starts very early on into a woman's life, whether she has those opportunities to become a decision maker. So we need to really make those structural changes.
So, you wrote this report in 2020. And you mentioned just at the start of this conversation that women between the ages of 25 and 54 lost more than twice as many jobs as men in Ontario, and women's labor force participation fell to its lowest level in 30 years, which is crazy. But what do these statistics look like in 2022? We're 2 years out and we've started the recovery process. What do the statistics look like now?
I do hope that we've started the recovery process. It's a roller coaster, really. When you look at the employment data from March until now, from March 2020 till now, it's up and down, along with the waves of the pandemic, of course. And women's participation rate and jobs outcome was much below men for most of that, but it just kept fluctuating. Today, I will say things look better for both women and men. They're both above their pre-pandemic job numbers. For women ages 15 plus in Ontario, employment's up 2% compared to February of 2020. But the other thing to note is that there's also population growth and immigration has ramped up. So there are just more women in general. So we actually don't know if those are people who left the workforce during COVID and have re-entered or if it's new entrants completely. population 15 plus is growing quite fast. So we don't have the longitudinal data to know what that is yet. But if we look more closely at the numbers, we also see that men are seeing higher gains in high income jobs than women. So there could be something of concern there. And we know that the kind of hardest hit sectors like accommodation and food have not recovered to their pre-employment levels. So a lot of women are still stuck there. And then as we discussed earlier, there's been a shift into people who retrained into different sectors. There's also been a shift from part-time employment to more full-time employment. And that's something we're monitoring because it's unclear whether it's people working longer hours. So they went from being classified as part-time to technically they're full-time now. We know in healthcare, for example, everyone's just working longer hours. Or is it because they're providing more stability now due to labor shortages? Employers are able to provide more permanent full-time employment. We don't know. But we do know that overall employment is up, and generally that's a good thing.
So, last question. We could talk about this report all day long. I think there's so much content in here, but have we experienced a She-Covery in your opinion, or is there more work to be done? What do we still have to do here?
I'd be curious to your thoughts too. I think there's still a long road ahead. I do worry that we'll go back to kind of a status quo in which there's been improvements in childcare, but women are still concentrated in certain sectors where they're paid less. The care economy is just not valued post-COVID as we had hoped it would be. I think we need to keep our feet on the gas pedal to kind of make sure that these changes actually happen. What's the saying? Like, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think this is an opportunity more than anything, but the improvements that we've seen now are not going to guarantee that there's a She-Covery. It's going to still take a lot of work.
Right. And I think that goes beyond the economic context as well. I mean, you talk about the discrimination and the uncomfortable workplaces, and this is something that we talk about a lot in our Women in Politics program too, is there aren't enough women around the decision-making bodies, as we discussed, and for those who are around the table, sometimes they're treated differently, and it's crazy in 2022 that this is still a reality, but it's something that we're looking at and trying to shine a light on, because if we don't keep talking about it, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And having women in politics will change the policies and it'll change the culture and it trickles down. So it's really important.
Exactly. That's what it all comes down to, is having more women in politics. Well, thank you so much, Claudia, for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can continue this conversation as we look to the future and hopefully face more of a She-Covery as the pandemic is hopefully in our rear view mirrors.
Thank you so much for having me on, and keep doing what you're doing. Important conversations.